So just that reminder of what the whole purpose of being here together is. It's a citizens' assembly on democracy in the UK, and it's been brought together to look at this big question about how should democracy in the UK work. So that's our big challenge and thing we're going to be looking at over the 6 weekends that we are together. So just that reminder of who's involved. We've got the Constitution Unit, part of the University College London, and they're the ones who really have made the Citizens' Assembly happen. And so Alan, who you heard from a few times last weekend, and you'll be hearing from quite a bit again this weekend, is one of the people sort of driving this assembly, and he'll be with us the whole way through as that kind of lead researcher taking us through the process. And the other people who are involved in making it happen are my team, so the organisation I work for involved. So all of the facilitators and the support team who are working away in the background to sort of make participating in this event as easy as we can for the rest of you. And just remember that if you have any tech problems, you know how to contact the support team, either via text, or you can use the chat function within the meeting, and that will go straight to the support team if you're having any problems with tech or anything like that. So the agenda for the weekend. Very shortly, we'll give you an opportunity to sort of check in and meet the group that you're going to be working with today. And then today is a bit of a learning day. It's a real sort of focus on learning. So we're going to spend the morning learning a bit more about how the UK's democratic system works and how the different parts of the system interact with each other. It's kind of what we've been calling in the background this sort of politics 101. And we just really want to make sure that everyone starts off with a good sort of basic understanding of some of the key parts of the system and their roles. Then we're going to be in the afternoon starting to look at the question of, well, what limits, if any, should be put on a democratically elected government, should be put on what a democratically elected government can do. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the afternoon. And then, if you think there should be limits, thinking about how different types of limits on government powers can actually be applied or enforced. And then towards the end of Sunday, we're going to come back to considering further some principles that we started thinking about at the end of the last weekend that should underpin what we think of as a good democracy. And remember, we haven't defined yet what a good democracy is. Everyone still has lots of different views on what actually will make a good democracy. And that's what we're going to be working towards, trying to see where we can find common ground on that. So just a reminder, there is the members website that you get sent links to in the emails that get sent out to you. Up on the members website now are all the recordings of all the presentations from the first weekend. So if you do want to go back and remind yourself of anything, you can go and look at them there. And for weekend 2, already up there, there is the agenda for the weekend and sort of speaker information. So a little bit of background about the various speakers that you're going to be hearing from. There's an updated glossary with some of the sort of key terms that are coming up through the presentations and the discussions, some of which might be, less familiar to some people. And there's also some additional information being put up there. At the end of last weekend, there were a number of requests for people from members about find out a little bit more about how politics is taught in schools and how that varies between the different devolved nations and across the UK. So the team at UCL have pulled some information together. So that's there on the website. And it's there if you're interested. If it's something you want to follow up, please do have a look, and hopefully it'll answer some of the questions that were being asked last week, the last weekend we were together. So before we go much further, a couple of little reminders. The conversation guidelines that we agreed at the last session to help make the conversations as useful and constructive and a good experience for everybody. We spoke about one voice at a time. We all know that that's a good way to have a conversation anyway, but on Zoom it can be really important because it cuts people out. And when we do that, by and large, most of the time when we're in the main room, we'll ask people to stay muted just so there's not background noise coming through with so many of us on the call. But obviously, when you're in your smaller breakout rooms, unless there's sort of a lot of interference or background noise where you are, probably is fine to like come off mute and try and have that more natural conversation. So, yeah, everyone has the right to speak and be listened to. That's why you're all here. We can disagree, but hopefully try not to be disagreeable about it. Keeping what's said in our Zoom room stays in the Zoom room, so not sort of attributing things to other people or talking, saying outside of the conversation, things that were said by individuals. And as we all know, we recognize that sometimes tech problems happen, but hopefully we can be patient and supportive of each other and try and minimize the impact of those on the discussions. And so they were the ones that we proposed to start with, which people seem to think were quite reasonable. And these were the ones that in your groups you came up with additionally. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see them there. Lots of things about actually trying to work well with each other, backing up your views with reasons, thinking about how you speak, because we all come from different backgrounds, we all have different personalities and expectations, but we want to try and make this a positive experience for everyone. So that's most of my introduction. So one more thing to say. I said today was going to be, again, a bit of a learning day. And there will be quite a few presentations through the day. But I really want to thank everybody who took the time to fill in the sort of survey at the end of last weekend, because apart from being really important to the sort of ongoing research around this topic, it actually gives us a really good insight of what things are working for you and what things, you're finding a bit challenging as we go through the process. So one of the things that was highlighted was that you didn't feel you had enough time in the discussions. And we recognize that. But what I'm going to ask you is, go with us on this. We will be having lots of short little discussions today, but they're building up towards when you'll have much more time tomorrow in your groups to really kind of go back and go, right, let's think about all the stuff we've kind of learned through Saturday and considered through Saturday. And on Sunday, have a lot more time in your groups to actually process it and do something with it. So hopefully go with us on this one. Okay, hopefully we are ready to open up the breakout rooms. And I think we are. I'll see you all soon. We're going to start. We're going to really start now with what I keep saying is our learning phase today. This sort of starting to really think about hearing a bit more about the core parts of the democratic system, about parliament, government, courts, general public, political parties, pressure groups, how all of these things interact to actually create a democratic system as we have it in the UK and how they fit together. So we're going to be hearing first from two speakers who are going to set out some of the basics of the system. And then we'll give you a little bit of time in your breakout rooms. And then we'll come back and we'll hear from a further two speakers that are going to be talking more about outside of what we traditionally think of the government system, but things around the courts, the judiciary, the rules of law, and also the roles of the general public, which we all know and we were discussing, and not just about, casting your vote every couple of years. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker now. He'll be familiar to you. So inviting back Alan Renwick, who's Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit and Professor in British Politics. So you will have heard from Alan, and he's going to get us started from today.
Great, thank you so much, Kayla, and it's great to see you all again. I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the democratic system in the UK before the other talks go into a little bit more detail. So there's my slides, which hopefully you can see popping up on your screens just about now. So if you remember from the very first talk that we had last time, we had a presentation from Parm on the Saturday morning, and she talked about how democracy in the ancient Greek means power of the people. So that basically is the idea that ultimately it's the people who are in charge in a democratic system. But of course, there are many millions of us. It would be pretty impractical for us all to be involved in making every decision. And most of us actually don't want to be involved that much anyway. So in practice, the people exercise their power in a democratic system by electing representatives. So we elect a body of representatives who form the parliament. Now, things are a little bit more complicated than that in the UK. So as many of you will be aware, the UK Parliament has two chambers, so two bodies of people who sit separately. And one of those, the House of Commons, is elected by the people. The other chamber, the House of Lords, is not elected, but mostly consists of people who've been appointed. And then in the UK, so we have the UK Parliament, but also some parts of the UK also have their own parliaments. So Scotland has the Scottish Parliament, Wales has the Welsh Parliament, or the Senedd, and Northern Ireland has the Northern Ireland Assembly. And then in addition, it's also worth mentioning local councils here. So we don't call local councils parliaments, but basically they're the same kind of thing. So they're a body of people whom we elect to represent us and do a lot of the day-to-day decision making. So we have the people in the democratic system and the people elect parliament. But even a parliament is still quite a lot of people. So there's a picture of the House of Commons, and there are 650 MPs in total in the House of Commons. And indeed, if you add in the House of Lords, then you've got almost 1,500 people in total in the Parliament of the UK. And it just wouldn't be practical for them all to sit there talking until finally they manage to get a decision out. You need to have some kind of leadership in Parliament. You need to have some people who are assigned the role of working out the overall direction of policy, making proposals, and implementing the decisions once they have been made. So that means that just as the people delegate power, if you like, to Parliament, so Parliament delegates quite a lot of day-to-day decision making to the government, the people who do those roles of working out the overall direction of policy, developing proposals, and then once decisions have been made, implementing those decisions. And as you will all be familiar, in the UK, the government is led by the Prime Minister, currently Boris Johnson, and under the Prime Minister sit various ministers who are responsible for particular areas of policy. So just a few examples there. We've got Liz Truss, responsible for foreign policy, Priti Patel, responsible for policing and other such matters, and Rishi Sunak, responsible for decisions on tax and spending. So that's the kind of core part, if you like, of the democracy in the UK, the people electing Parliament and then the Parliament choosing the government. Now, there are other ways of designing a democratic system. So another way of doing it is to have the people electing separately both a parliament and also a president, who's the head of the executive. So if you think of the system in the United States, for example, Congress, which is the equivalent of our parliament, is elected, and so is the president, currently Joe Biden. And actually, we have something like that system in parts of the UK that have a directly elected mayor, where the mayor is kind of like a local president with much more limited powers, obviously, operating alongside the local councils. But there are very few people who would argue for that kind of system at national level in the UK. So that's another way of doing it, but it's not one that I'll talk about further here. So the focus here is on the UK's democratic system, put it in the center of the slide and the center of our minds. But then if you think again back to Parm's presentation last weekend, the slide where she had a picture of King John signing Magna Carta back in 1215, she talked about the fact that another fundamental part of democracy, beside power of the people, is the principle of the rule of law. So the principle that those who are in power can't do just whatever they like. Rather, they have to follow rules, and if they want to change those rules, they have to do so according to certain agreed procedures. And most people would say that that rule of law is absolutely essential for democracy even to get going. So there we have a picture on the slide there of the basic principles of the democratic system in the UK. And now we're going to, in these talks this morning, we're going to talk you through these various parts of the system. And this will actually also be the structure that we follow over the next few weekends of the Citizens' Assembly as well. So this is what these are the core bits of democracy, and we're going to work systematically through these parts of the democratic system over the next few weekends. So I'm going to say just a few more words now about government. I guess the Prime Minister is the most familiar person in the democratic system, so that's a good place to start. Then the second talk from Meg will focus on Parliament and the relationship between Parliament and government. Then Anand in the third talk will talk about the role of the people. So I talked about the people there electing Parliament, which is very important, but there are many other roles for the people in the democratic system. And then finally, the fourth talk from Michael will be on the rules and the rule of law and the various different ways in which rules can be enforced. So on government, so firstly, it's useful just to say a few words on the word government itself. It's a rather problematic word because we use it in various different ways. So one way in which we use that word is to refer to ministers. So these are the politicians, the people from Parliament who are given responsibility for decision making in particular areas, or in case of the Prime Minister, overall responsibility for the whole agenda. So when we talk about Boris Johnson's government, that's what we mean. We mean the set of ministers, the people from the party or parties in charge who are responsible for particular issues. But we also often use the word government to refer both to ministers and to officials, to civil servants, to the people who've got a permanent job in government. So are not people from a political party, but are neutral officials and are responsible for advising ministers and for doing a lot of the work of implementing the decisions once they've been made. And both these senses of government are very important. You'll hear them all the time. Sometimes we also use the word executive or the executive branch to refer to government in either of these two senses. And then there's also a third way in which we use the word government to refer, and this is a bit confusing, I know, but we do it, to refer to the whole system through which we're governed. So including the government as I've just defined it, but also Parliament and the courts and elections and all the other various bits and pieces. And there we might refer to the system of government. So just be aware when you're listening to the various talks today and over future weekends, that people are going to be using the word government in these different ways. And if it's not clear just how they're using it, then always feel free to ask during the discussion periods just to clarify what's going on. And then finally from me, I talked about how Parliament delegates power to a government, but how does Parliament actually choose the government? Well, the crucial question here is, does one party have a majority of the seats in Parliament, so the positions in Parliament? So most of us at election time, when we're choosing between the candidates, are thinking mainly about which party those candidates represent and which party we want to support. And each party has a leader who is that party's candidate for being Prime Minister. So if the answer to that question is yes, one party does have a majority of seats in Parliament, then it's basically automatic that that party's leader becomes the Prime Minister and goes on to form a government. So that's what happened, for example, in 2019 after the last general election in the UK, when Boris Johnson's Conservative Party had a majority of the seats in the House of Commons, and therefore Boris Johnson became Prime Minister and the Conservatives formed the government. On the other hand, sometimes there's no one party with a majority, an absolute and overall majority of seats in Parliament. And then the party leaders have to negotiate with each other to work out what to do. So in 2010, for example, in the UK, David Cameron's Conservative Party was the largest party in the House of Commons, but didn't have an overall majority of seats. So David Cameron negotiated with the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition. Or in the Scottish Parliament at the moment, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, are just short of an overall majority, so they have an agreement with the Green Party and form the government together. And once the government is in place, then it continues to be the government so long as it has the support, or what we call the confidence, to use the jargon, of the majority of MPs or MSPs, or the majority in the Parliament. If they have that support, then they continue as the government. If they lose that support, then the government falls, and either there's a new government or a fresh election. So that's enough from me. A very quick tour of the overall system of democracy in the UK. And I shall return back to Kayla.
Okay, so as I said, this is our learning time. We're going to spend that 1 minute quiet, just sort of take any notes, any reflections on that, any questions, because you will have an opportunity to ask questions later. So we'll just take 1 minute before we go on to our next speaker. Okay, I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, who's going to sort of build on that sort of framework that Alan has started to set out for you and talk very much more about sort of Parliament and government. So our next speaker is Meg Russell, who's Professor of British and Comparative Politics and a Director of the Constitution Unit at UCL. So over to you, Meg.
Thank you very much, Kayla. So yes, my name is Meg Russell, and I'm actually one of the researchers on the project alongside Alan. So it's really great to be here to talk to you about Parliament. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking part in this very important project. We're really keen to hear what you've got to say. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. My slides have come up, terrific. Okay, so Parliament is central to our system of democracy, and I'd like to briefly reflect on what it's for, what actually comprises Parliament, and how it's similar or different to arrangements in other countries. I suggest that there are 4 key things that Parliament does. The first is representation. Members of Parliament, or MPs, are elected from every corner of the UK to go to Westminster and have their voices heard. Each constituency of around 70,000 people elects 1 MP, and MPs will often try and express the interests of their constituents or local areas in Parliament. MPs also nearly all represent political parties, so they voice political party views as well. And in both of these ways, because individual citizens vote for MPs and for political parties, it's often said that Parliament performs a linkage function, linking between citizens and the system of government. This is a key part of what we call representative democracy, that MPs and other elected politicians act on citizens' behalf. The second role of Parliament is holding government to account. As Alan's indicated, the government is only the government on the basis that it can command the support or the confidence of the House of Commons. This means MPs also ultimately have the power to remove the government via a no confidence vote. That happens very rarely, but it does mean the government needs to be careful to explain itself to Parliament. Through various mechanisms, which we can discuss more at the next weekend of the Assembly, Parliament can hold the government publicly accountable for its actions, asking questions, demanding explanations, and making suggestions for change. Third, and as a special case of government accountability, Parliament's approval is required for legislation. That means that if the government wants to change the law, it presents a proposal in the form of a bill to Parliament, which is debated and voted upon. The House of Commons has to approve the change. The House of Lords, in most cases, has less power and can be overruled by the House of Commons. There are some exceptions to this pattern of government bills. Government can also propose smaller legal changes which require less attention in Parliament. Parliament itself can also propose bills, but mostly it's only bills proposed by government that actually become law. The fourth function of Parliament is less about direct power and more about being a public forum that represents the nation. As well as scrutinising government and considering legislation, Parliament also holds debates on the key matters of the day. So, for example, if there's a national or international crisis, or a mood in the country that something ought to change, or just a need to think things through, like the impact of new technologies, this will be debated in Parliament. Crucially, Parliament is a very public place where debates are televised and transcribed. This means the public can see and hear what gets discussed in Parliament, and journalists can report it, creating transparency and accountability. So that's what Parliament does, but at a more basic level, what is Parliament? Who sits there? Well, as Alan said, Parliament has two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons has 650 members, each elected to represent an individual constituency. Usually, though not always, the government has a majority in the House of Commons. That is, the government's party, or combination of parties, if there's a coalition, like during 2010 to 2015, holds a majority of seats. That party majority can mean that the government finds it fairly easy to win votes in the House of Commons. The House of Lords, in contrast, isn't elected. It has around 800 members, most of whom have been appointed by successive prime ministers to sit for life. A key difference between the chambers is that the government doesn't hold a majority in the House of Lords. That's partly because there are around 200 members who don't sit for a political party. The Commons, as I've already referred to, is significantly more powerful than the Lords. It can vote the government out of office and must vote for bills before they become law. But there's no expectation that the government should retain the confidence of the House of Lords, and it can also only delay rather than veto most bills. What happens most of the time is that the Lords suggests amendments and encourages members of the House of Commons to look at things again, but that MPs can ignore the Lords' suggestions if they please. Generally in Parliament, rather than one group forcing another to change direction, the fact that the Commons is watching the government and the Lords is watching the Commons, and this is all happening in public, means that policy is more carefully considered. Finally, it's worth a word about how the arrangements at Westminster differ from other places. All democracies have a parliament, and much of what happens at Westminster is pretty standard, but a few comparisons are worth pointing out. First, the Westminster Parliament clearly has two chambers, and some parliaments have only one. Two-chamber parliaments are common in large democracies, for example, like France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and the US. Often smaller countries have just one chamber, and notably the devolved legislatures in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland each has only one. Second, the House of Lords is unusual in being unelected, but it's not unique. Notably, the Canadian Senate is all appointed. Third, the Westminster electoral system makes single-party majorities in the House of Commons quite likely. In contrast, European countries using more proportional electoral systems are often governed by coalitions. And coalition or minority government, as Alan said, is the norm in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Fourth, the electoral system also creates a strong link between individual MPs and their constituencies, which is less the case in most countries using proportional systems. And finally, the Westminster Parliament is large, and the House of Lords particularly so. Places like Germany and France also have large parliaments, though their second chambers are much smaller than the Lords. Whether having a large parliament is a good thing or not is arguable. On the one hand, it can look inefficient. On the other hand, it increases the diversity of voices and means that constituencies are smaller so that MPs may have more time to be responsive to local citizens. So that's absolutely in a nutshell some of the key points about the Westminster Parliament. I hope we'll go into a bit more detail in 2 weeks' time, but that's given you a flavour for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Meg. So before we go into the breakout rooms, again, we'll just take that 1 minute to sort of reflect on anything Meg said, note down any questions, note down anything that seems important. Okay, we're going to open up breakout rooms in a minute. We're going to have about 15 minutes just to be able to reflect on what you've heard, think, identify if there are any questions, anything you need clarification for. Speakers are available to drop in and answer any sort of questions for clarification. And then you'll be going on a 10-minute break. And then we will see you back in the main room for the next presentation. So if we can open up the breakout rooms now. So I know that was a quick little discussion, and I know lots of questions were being asked, kept our speakers very, very busy jumping back and forth between rooms. I know there was a couple of rooms that people didn't get to. They're still on the list. The conversations we're having this morning are all sort of all building on each other. So Alan and Meg are still around. as well as the speakers that you're going to hear from next are around. So you can still be calling on people through all of the conversations, because they're all designed to build up this understanding of how the system as a whole, the democratic system in the UK as a whole, works. And don't worry if actually this seems like a massively big and complex issue. It's because it is. It's because it is. And people like Alan and Meg have spent years studying this sort of stuff. You're not going to know it all after 2 10-minute presentations. But gradually, as we build through and add more information, more sort of bits of knowledge, and then when we come back in weekend 3 and we're going to do a much deeper dive into sort of the idea of sort of government and parliament and their roles and some of the challenges and tensions there. So it's about building up the understanding. So don't worry if some of it's seeming new and a bit too much to take in today. You're not going to know everything by the end of today. You're not going to know everything by the end of the assembly, but you'll hopefully know a lot and already are having really informed and interesting and difficult conversations, trying to sort of get to the bottom of some of these challenges. So on that basis, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who many of you will hopefully remember also spoke to us last time we met. So pleased to welcome back Anand Menon, who's the Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. But today he's really going to be talking to us very much about the role of the public and how people are involved in the democratic system. So I'm going to hand over to Anand now.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. Thanks for having me back again. Usually when we talk about things being political, we tend to mean the sort of stuff that Meg and Alan have been talking about already. Politicians who form governments and make decisions on our behalf. But politics is about people like you and me as well, and I've been asked to talk about how we can participate in the political process. Now, obviously, one way we could do it is to become politicians and take the decisions ourselves, and every now and again it's worth reminding ourselves that politicians are people too. But if I assume that not many of us want that sort of career path, we need to talk about other ways of getting involved. Now, the most obvious way is by voting. And voting in elections. At the last general election, about 67% of the people who were allowed to vote turned out and did so. And then, of course, apart from elections, we've got referendums. I assume you remember referendums. One of the interesting things about referendums is they're relatively novel in our system, and so there are still loads of questions about them that we've got to ask, like, should they be binding? Is 50% plus one vote enough to make major decisions that might affect us for decades to come? Now, whatever your answers to these questions, the fact is that voting is the only way most of us get directly involved in politics. In fact, many people think politics starts and stops simply with voting, but they're wrong. There are loads of other ways in which we, the public, can engage with politicians, engage with politics and try and influence them. One is by writing to your MP. Now, MPs get loads of letters, so you've got to wonder whether they're going to reply properly to all of them. On the other hand, one tactic that people use is to try and get loads of people to bombard MPs with letters about a particular topic in the hope that it alerts them to the fact that there are strong public feelings about that issue. And about a third of people say, we don't know whether they do, they'd be willing to go and meet their MP or send an email to them if they felt strongly enough about something. Now, bear in mind, at the start of last century, some MPs never went to their constituencies at all. Now, nearly all MPs think it's important to be present. They're sensitive to criticisms of being absentee. This at least makes them more accessible to us, their constituents. More and more people are also signing online petitions. More and more people, I should say, are also bragging about the fact on Facebook, which I personally find a bit annoying, but that's just me. But over 6 million people, so about 10% of the population, signed a petition on Brexit a few years ago. And 50,000 people signed a petition saying Jeremy Clarkson should be Prime Minister. Yep, you heard that right. Now, this is engagement, however fleeting, with politics. And remember, UK Parliament petitions may get time to be debated in the House of Commons if they reach 100,000 signatures. Though I have to say, I think that the sort of petition websites we see now, like change.org or 38 degrees, could undermine the value of petitions simply because they generate so many. And then there are more traditional people who don't mind spending their evenings and their weekends making banners to get ready for demonstrations to make their voices heard the old-fashioned way. These are the people who sit in the middle of the road and block the traffic, or who shout outside Parliament. Now, this is obviously active engagement, but only about 15% of us say we'd consider going to a demonstration, a picket, or going on a march. And there is a debate to be had about what an acceptable protest is. What level of disruption do you think it's reasonable for demonstrators to cause? And then there's that small minority who go even further and pay their hard-earned cash to join a political party. Around 1.5% of us are members of the Labour Party or the Conservatives or even the monster raving loonies. Now, the first thing to say is the role of members is different in different parties. Labour members have more say over policies than Tory members. But even then, there are members and members. Most members have a direct debit of a few quid a month that they've basically forgotten about. Very, very few, even members of parties, are active. Fewer than 1% deliver leaflets or knock on doors. In fact, party membership is declining significantly, and this means that we, the voters, tend to be less loyal to parties than we once were. And it's one reason, incidentally, why elections are so much more unpredictable than they were. 49% of us changed the party we voted for between 2010 and 2017, which is unheard of. Now, all these numbers tell part of the story, but only part, because there's far much more to politics than all this. So here's a question. Is helping out at your local food bank a political activity? Because 40,000 people did it last year. I bet many of them don't think that they're being political, but they are. They're engaging in activities, interacting with both the state and society. But you've got to ask yourself, is it right that well-meaning individuals should do this rather than the state itself? And finally, of course, how could we forget there are citizens' assemblies like this one that we convene to address tricky issues. In the UK, we've used them across a range of issues: social care, the future of Scotland, congestion and public transport. The Scottish and Northern Irish governments say they'll hold at least one assembly a year to try and discuss difficult issues. And there's interest in Westminster in them as a way of involving us, the public, more directly. Now, I think you people are as well placed as anyone to say whether you think this is a good idea or not. So these are all the ways in which we, the public, can engage with and influence politics. But there's influence and there's influence. And when it comes to influence, we're not all equal. With the ballot box, each of us, in principle at least, has an equal say. But that's not so true outside of election time. There's money. Rupert Murdoch has huge power via his media empire, including The Sun and The Times. Prime ministers woo him and try and get the support of his papers. And money's also an issue for the parties themselves. The vast majority of Tory party donations come from individuals. Yet during the 2019 election campaign, 93% of Labour's donations came from trade unions. Now, this does raise big questions because it's hard to ignore the advice of a big donor. But should we try and limit donations? Should we regulate how much influence donors have? And if you're answering yes to those questions, do you have the faintest clue how we would do that? And of course, it's not just money, it's profile too. Think about Marcus Rashford. You can't deny that he's had massive influence over politics, but should he be able to? And look into your hearts and try and figure out whether your answer depends on whether you agree with what he's saying or not. So it's not as simple as saying follow the money. There are all sorts of ways some people manage to make their voices heard more effectively than others. It can even be a case of personal connections. I mean, again, politicians are human, and like all humans, they tend to trust the people they know. But should you have the ear of the Prime Minister because you shared a room with her at university, or because you went to the same school at her? You may want to consider in the weekends to come whether you're comfortable with this kind of influence. And again, if you're not comfortable, what on earth could be done to control it? So there you go. I've given you loads of questions and no answers. Sorry about that.
Thanks very much, Anand. Again, we'll just take that 1 minute before we go into the breakout rooms, just to sort of have that moment, think about what Anand said, and any questions or any reflections on that. Okay, we are going to go into the breakout rooms. Just that reminder that not only Anand is there, but we're building on these conversations. Alan and Meg are still around too, and actually can also, all three of them can answer all sorts of questions across different things as well. So do call on them. And Terry, if your group wants to call on Anand straight away, if there is something that you want to pick up on, I'm sure we can ask him to join your group. So let's open the breakout rooms. Okay, so it looks like everyone's back now. Hopefully, again, these conversations are building up. And remember, you do have all the speakers that are there still here, so you can come into the different rooms at different points as your conversation emerges. Now, we have our final speaker for this morning. So really pleased to be able to introduce Michael Orlakerton. Yes, I almost did it. I almost got his name right. I'm really sorry, Michael. But Michael, really pleased to have you with us. Michael's a research leader in citizenship and the rule of law and head of public and youth engagement at the Bingham Centre. And the Bingham Centre is an organisation working to advance the rule of law across the world. So really excited to hear what he's going to add now to our building up the blocks of how the democratic system works and how we make sure the rules are actually followed. So if we can hand over to Michael now.
Certainly, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be able to address you all. So my talk is going to be about rules. Why do we need rules? Jean-Jacques Rousseau is well known for saying that man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And in saying that, he was raising the idea that people hate being told what to do, they hate being ordered around, and they absolutely hate rules. But he understood that people would be willing to follow rules that they see as legitimate. So for him, social authority came from a social contract that's agreed between citizens and their leaders. Fast forward several hundred years to 2021, and there's almost no area of human activity in which you'll not find rules governing conduct. From laws to regulations to codes of practice, there are really important rules and really important reasons for those rules. And I very briefly want to set out what I think a few of those are. So why do we need rules? Well, rules keep us safe, and just think about how the possibility of life imprisonment, for example, creates this huge disincentive against murder. You could think about how rules help us to realize when something's gone wrong. Where rules are broken, we can adjust expectations or requirements, and that enables people to meet those rules. And finally, rules draw lines about what is acceptable conduct, and they empower us to be able to shape our conduct in line with those rules. You could think about, for example, the age of consent that defines when young people should be treated as adults or children in a sexual context. So that's a bit about why rules are important. And I just want to look at some of the institutions and the structures that dictate how those rules are enforced in the UK. I think the obvious thing to talk about from my perspective are the courts, which are the ultra formal systems that deal with conduct that is either of a serious criminal nature or a serious civil nature. And the place that the courts fit within our current discussion is that typically you'd say that the role of elected politicians is to conduct their political programme, elect their manifesto, etc. You'd say the role of the rest of parliamentarians in the House of Commons and Lords is to make law. Well, the judges are the third part of that trifecta. They are interpreting the rules, the law, and seeing how it applies in individual cases. And they determine disputes between parties of all sorts, be they individuals, companies, public bodies, and sometimes that public body is the government. But courts are not the be-all and end-all of rules and their enforcement. You have ombudspersons, ombudsmen and women, specialist independent complaints handlers who have been appointed to deal with specific problems, such as the Housing Ombudsman Service or the Local Authority and Social Care Ombudsman Service. There are also watchdogs who are non-departmental bodies that are set up to specifically provide oversight in a given area. You have high-profile watchdogs in the news space, such as the Independent Press Organisation and Impress. I'm particularly engaged with the work of the Information Commissioner's Office, which is a watchdog that's been set up to protect our rights around data protection. And Elizabeth Benham, the Information Commissioner, was particularly active around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, again, operating on one of the important areas in our democracy. So those are a few institutional structures for the enforcement of rules. And I'd just like to think about a particular philosophy for how rules should be first created, disputed, changed, and enforced. And that is the rule of law. So hopefully he finds his props. In his seminal book, The Rule of Law, Tom Bingham was essentially saying that the rule of law requires the law to be accessible, clear, and practicable, and for everybody to be held equally accountable before systems of rules. Yeah, even the government. And that's something that, as an African, was particularly striking to me when first learning a bit about the law, because I grew up on stories of governments that were beyond the reach of citizens holding them to account. And it relates quite closely to this quote by the great Roman poet Juvenal, who asked, who will watch the watchers? What's the extent to which we should hold the government to account, and how do you do that? And systems of laws and rules have often been the way that that's done. So courts can check and balance the actions of the executive and the government through human rights and public law. They're complemented by watchdogs such as the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, who investigates whether members of Parliament have breached the House of Commons Code of Conduct. And you also have IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, that regulates the business costs, pay and pensions of MPs. So all of that together are a series of ways in which rules are enforced. But I also think that citizens have a key role to play in the creation and enforcement of all the rules across our society. If you want a new rule, a new law, a new code of practice, the ability to speak to your member of parliament, to commit to direct action, and other forms of expression are key ways in which people seek to influence what the rules are, how often they're changed, and how they're enforced. And those are informal ways that we can go about enforcing rules as citizens in a democracy. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And just as normal, we'll take that 1 minute of quiet time before we go to reflect, take notes, think of questions before we go back into the breakout rooms. Okay, we're going to put you back into the breakout rooms now for a bit of a longer conversation that can start building together. Firstly, reflecting on what you've just heard from Michael, but then starting to think, how does the system as a whole really come together, and how well does it work? So remember that all of the speakers that you've heard from this morning are still available. So as you come back to different points of the system, you might want to call on individual speakers to come and be able to answer some sort of clarification or give, clarification questions, really. Remembering that we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of the system yet, but we've got 4 more weekends as well. So just another reminder, particularly now that you're going into a longer conversation, if you can, particularly when you're in your small breakout rooms, have your cameras on. I know there's a couple of people that are struggling because of sort of internet connections, but if possible, try and get your cameras on. It makes it so much easier for people to feel that they're talking to a real person rather than a screen or a picture. So yeah, if you can, please do turn your cameras on, particularly when you're in the breakout rooms. And other than that, I will see you just before 12:30.